Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Turkey and its involvement in Libya specifically, where the country is to send troops and advanced weapons to back the UN-sponsored, or UN-supported, I should say, Libyan government. That's called the Libya's Government of National Accord, GNA for short. That government is struggling at this time to repel an offensive by General Khalifa Haftar's Eastern Forces, or the Libyan National Army as they are known by their abbreviation LNA. Now, Turkey and GNA have signed a defense cooperation as well as a separate deal on maritime boundaries in the East Mediterranean as well. And both of those things are important, certainly. Firstly, of course, on the military deal, that's, as I said already, to support the GNA. But secondly, when it comes to the maritime borders issue and boundaries issues in the East Mediterranean, as we know, and as those of you who follow the issues in the East Mediterranean know, that there are a number of disputes in that area. So there's a lot of ramifications for that sort of deal as well, for that body of water. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by Yusuf Irim, who is the Turkey analyst at TRT World. He's joining us now on the line from Istanbul. Yusuf, as always, we appreciate your time today. What do you make of the deal as it's currently being signed? The two deals, I should say, pardon me. Firstly, on defense cooperation and maritime boundaries. If we can, let's start with the maritime boundaries, because there seems to be a number of countries who would dispute the way that Turkey may have signed this deal with Libya at this time.
Well, the maritime deal is very, very important for Turkey because we've seen many of its coastal neighbors take steps to keep Turkey out of the Eastern Mediterranean, try to landlock it into its coastal waters. So this bilateral deal signed between Turkey and the Government of National Accord, as you stated, the UN-recognized government in Libya, allows Turkey to demarcate its exclusive economic zone, giving it a very important place now in the Eastern Mediterranean and making it a player. But at the same time, as it's expanding into the Eastern Mediterranean, this deal has also put pressure on the GNA because there are many countries that don't want to see Turkey have such an important territory in the Eastern Mediterranean. Hence, this has led Turkey to sign a security and military agreement with the GNA, as you already stated as well, to protect the GNA and make sure that it doesn't collapse under the pressure that the warlord Khalifa Haftar is placing on them. Yeah. But Turkey looks like it's taking it even one step further now. They're preparing a deployment bill, which is, as President Erdogan stated, will be presented to Turkish Parliament the day it reopens, which is January 7th. So it's looking like the security and military agreement that was signed a couple of weeks ago, which was only meant to provide assistance and basic transfer of services, has now gone a step further, and we may see Turkish combat troops on the ground before the month of January is over.
But Yusuf, wouldn't it have been better for Turkey to have worked with all of the above countries who have interests in those waters to begin with? Why go about it in this fashion?
Well, work with who? Who can Turkey work with? Greece? Turkey has tried to work with Greece probably for the past decade. With the Greek Cypriot administration in Cyprus, so Turkey doesn't have normal relations ever since the 1963 coup that Greece tried to launch on the island that led to the death of many Turkish Cypriots, and then another 1974 coup that was launched on the island as well, when Turkey had to intervene, and now the island is split in two with a Greek Cypriot administration in the south and a Turkish Cypriot administration in the north, one that only Turkey recognizes and no one else does, but that doesn't change the realities on the ground that the island is split into. Israel is another country that Turkey has had problems with, so it has not been able to sit down with its coastal neighbors and reach a deal. Libya is a country that Turkey has had very good relations with, very historic relations with, predating the GNA, even predating Gaddafi. So it looked like the best agreement that Turkey could have made, and now it's strengthening its hand. President Erdogan has stated that he's ready to make more deals with other coastal neighbors, even ones that he has problems with. So that remains to be seen how he's going to diplomatically maneuver these exclusive economic zone agreements in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Exactly, and that leads me to, in fact, my question simply about that, because these countries, as you alluded to in your first answer, also will put further pressure on the GNA regarding this deal. Do you think that Turkey has, and I'm sure it has, but just how do you think it's calculated, the benefit, the cost-benefit analysis at this time regarding this issue, alongside, of course, that pressure, which no doubt will now increase?
Well, what Turkey's most likely hoping for with this military deployment, which is probably coming in 2 to 3 weeks, they're not going to come there as an offensive force. I don't think the Turkish troop mandate will be to fight Haftar and to gain land on behalf of the GNA. I think that the Turkish mandate will be to lock this war into a stalemate, forcing Haftar to the table. Turkey would much rather see a diplomatic solution. Frankly, President Erdogan, from his comments, he doesn't see a military solution to Libya. So locking this in a stalemate would force Haftar to the table, allowing the LNA and the GNA to maybe reach a deal where they can avoid further civil war in the country. That would definitely be a desired effect of this deployment. Now, there's a very important meeting coming up January 8th between the Turkish president and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, in Istanbul. They'll be opening the Turkish Stream gas pipeline, and this event will give both leaders a chance to sit down and discuss Libya, because I know for a fact that Libya will be very high on the agenda, probably the number one priority for both leaders when they get together, along with Syria, of course. But it looks like the Russians right now are supporting Haftar. There is some type of Wagner presence, a private military contractor in the area, which has helped Haftar restart his offensive. This is something that is greatly bothering Turkey, and we'll see what happens when these two leaders get together.
I imagine that a huge factor in Turkey's calculations when it comes to the region, be it Libya or even really Syria, is the issue of refugees, right? Because President Erdogan has said a number of times already that Turkey simply cannot take in another wave of refugees. He was talking specifically at that time about Syria, but I imagine that refugees and that entire issue from Libya would also be an important factor here?
I think the refugee issue is much more important factor in Libya for France and Italy, because obviously Turkey geographically does not have a direct border with Libya like it did Syria. So the refugee impact directly on Turkey won't be detrimental coming from Libya. Probably very, very small flow of refugees to Turkey. But this is something that greatly concerns Italy and France, and they have both signed refugee deals. I know Italy signed one in 2017 with the government of national accord, which they don't support anymore. They're shifting their support to Haftar right now, the Italians. But it's funny that they're signing their refugee deals with the government of national accord. So there's a little hypocrisy on the side of the Italians over there. But the migration coming out of North Africa has always been a huge EU problem. I was at the EU-AU summit in Africa in 2018. This was what was dominating the agenda over there, especially when Macron and Merkel were talking to the African leaders at the summit. They wanted some type of controls on these migrant issues, and any type of further destabilization, especially in Tripoli, a city with hundreds of thousands, millions of people living there, will be incredibly detrimental to the EU from a migrant perspective.
I'm going to ask you this because it feels like at some level that Turkey has, I don't want to use this phrase, but I'm going to use it anyhow, its hands at many pots at this time, where it's involved in Syria to an extent right now, and now it's signed this deal with the GNA in Libya, and it's obviously not that same sort of involvement, but nevertheless, do you think that there is this possibility of just being overstretched?
I think Turkey's overstretched at all, because when you look at what it's doing in Syria, it's there mainly in an advise and assist role. So you don't have a huge Turkish military footprint in Syria. It looks like Turkey's going to have a bigger military footprint in Libya, but you're talking about NATO's second biggest army. You're talking about an army with 400, 500, 600,000 professional soldiers. So these two conflicts that Turkey is in right now, they are not fully invested in from a military aspect. So Turkey's definitely not overstretched. I believe that they can implement change in both conflicts and still have enough capacity to deal with what's going on in Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean as well.
Okay, so then there are, as you mentioned, there's going to be that meeting with Russians soon, and Turkey and officials there. There are disagreements, certainly, I would imagine, when it comes to Libya, possibly behind the scenes. I'm sure those have already been expressed on both sides, really, and have been under discussion, and now more so, possibly with these deals that have been signed. Do you think, and how do you think, Turkey is going about dealing with all of this diplomatically? Because certainly in Libya, there are a lot of hands in that pot as well, and in Syria, certainly, as we've been discussing for a very long time, when that issue comes up in conversation. Turkey cannot obviously just create enemies with all of the countries who would be in external or opposing sides from where it chooses to support. So for example, the countries that support Khalifa Haftar, I would imagine that Turkey would not want to create enemies out of them or any negative feelings there. So how will all of that be dealt with? How will all of that be balanced, do you think?
The Libya issue is very interesting because it's not just Libya. It's such a huge situation right now. You have, when you look at the dynamics, you have NATO allies on different sides. You have the EU involved. You have the Eastern Mediterranean broader perspective of this conflict. You have a very important North African nation, Libya. You have many of Turkey's coastal neighbors watching very closely what's going on. You have important powers like France and Italy. You have Egypt, its neighbor. Now Turkey met with Tunisia, so slowly Tunisia is understanding the importance of what's going on. You have a Wagner presence from Russia as a private military contractor representing Russian interests. Now Turkey's sending soldiers. The UAE is sending their jets. Their jets are constantly performing airstrikes in that region. So this is a very important topic to many countries. Now, yes, Turkey does have problems with a couple of these countries that are involved, most namely actually Egypt. I think Egypt is a very important playmaker in Libya right now. I've talked to correspondents who have returned from Libya, and they're telling me that the Egyptian jets that are performing airstrikes are creating a very bad situation on the ground from a humanitarian perspective. So I know that President Erdogan does not look very warmly on Sisi. He views him as an illegitimate leader ever since the coup that saw his regime remove Mohamed Morsi. So it's going to be very difficult for Turkey to negotiate with an important player like Egypt in this scenario. But most likely the Russians, maybe the French can mediate some type of diplomatic discussions. I wouldn't be surprised if we see an Astana-type group, a small group of 4 or 5 countries that can act dynamically and that have skin in the game, that can directly implement change on the ground in the conflict, get together in the coming month or two. So that could be something that we could see coming up. We could just see the Turks and the Russians moving forward and seeing how that goes. There's been talk of a deal brewing between Putin and Erdogan. I've heard whispers and rumors about it. I can't confirm anything at the moment, but that'll be interesting to see. So we have about 10 days, 11 days till the Putin-Erdogan meeting. I think that'll be very deciding in what's going to happen in the coming months in Libya.
Very well. And just before I let you go, Yusuf, I want to ask about the United Nations factor in all of this. Certainly the GNA, as we both mentioned, is the UN-backed Libyan government, the official government, the only internationally recognized government, really. Why isn't the United Nations more involved? And do you think it will support what Turkey is doing?
I mean, I think they'll support what Turkey is doing. At least they'll look like they're supporting what Turkey is doing. But what type of real support that'll mean, what type of difference that'll make on the ground will most likely be negligible. I mean, we've talked about all these countries that are supporting Haftar. Every one of the countries I've mentioned are members of the UN. So it seems that none of these countries, whether it be France or Italy, Russia or Egypt or the UAE, are respecting the UN recognized government over there. So it seems to be a non-factor in this conflict. And frankly, I just don't think the UN right now has the unity and the capability to be able to implement any type of decision that's going to ward off these countries from supporting Haftar. So this looks like something that Turkey is going to be going at it alone. They're trying to get support from Qatar, from Tunisia, from Algeria, some of the local players. We're going to have to see. I mean, I really don't think that this Turkish troop deployment is going to be offensive, but I do think it's going to be a game changer once Turkish boots hit the ground over there, because it will stop the Haftar offensive and most likely push him back to the table. And that's when we might see the UN get back into the game, maybe mediating something at the table between all sides. That remains to be seen because there's so many uncertainties and variables right now.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave it there at that, Yusuf, and we always appreciate your time and, of course, the context that you provide to important issues related to Turkey. That was Yusuf Idem speaking to us from Istanbul. Viewers, as we discussed there with Yusuf, there are two main issues right now when it comes to Turkey's involvement in Libya. There are those two deals that it has signed with the GNA, the Government of National Accord, the only government that has been supported by the United Nations, the only internationally recognized government of Libya, of course. General Khalifa Haftar's Libyan National Army, the LNA, is not recognized technically internationally. However, there are players, important international players, who support him at this time against the GNA. Turkey coming in on the side of the UN-backed government, also signing a maritime boundary deal when it comes to the East Mediterranean, so it can then look for natural resources in that area, which it has not yet been able to tap into for several reasons, such as the disputes that it has with many of its neighboring countries in those regards. That will then become certainly an obstacle going forward, I would imagine, for this deal. Maybe President Erdogan is possibly working on that behind the scenes diplomatically somehow, so the pressure that's brought onto the GNA, as well as his own country regarding that boundary deal in the East Mediterranean, will not be as significant as it may seem right now. There are also, of course, other issues such as the refugee issue that I had put to Yusuf Idem. However, obviously it's not as significant as the Syria refugee issue. Nevertheless, it's important for Europe as well. So Europe should possibly look at this Turkish involvement with some happiness, possibly, depending on which European player you're even talking about. We'll leave it there for now, though, for this segment. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. In this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Iran. As we know, protests have been taking place there for a number of weeks now, especially starting off with the fuel price hike, and then about certain other grievances in the country as well. There has then been this issue about the internet in that country, and that being shut down in many parts, especially at the height of the protests a number of weeks ago. And now there's talk again of certain parts of the country where mobile internet services may be clamped down on to an extent and have already been shut down in certain areas. Again, in the wake of expected protests to continue at this time, especially of those family members of whom people were killed or died in the protests that recently took place. There is this argument on the part of the Iranian government, and especially the spokesman for Iran's Guardian Council said that, listen, terrorists, if they use a certain medium, and he used the example of a road or a freeway, then to be able to block them from doing their work, you need to then block the freeway. And that's certainly an argument which at some level may work, might convince certain people, because if there is a threat to the country, if the country does feel, especially in the wake of that state media report about U.S. arms being found, that there is a threat from the outside, then does that make sense or not? We'll put those questions to our panelists now who are joining us. We're joined by Hamid Reza Ghulamzadeh, who is the president of the Peace Spirit Foundation, as well as a PhD candidate in American Studies. He's joining us now from the Iranian capital, Tehran. We're also joined by Khunche Tazmini, who is a political scientist and author. She's visiting fellow at Middle East Center at LSE, where she researches Iran-related themes. Khunche and Hamid Reza, thank you both for your time today. Hamid Reza, let me start with you. What do you make of this issue of the internet shutdown? I mean, we're using the internet right now to speak to you, but what does this mean for the country going forward with its relationship with how open the internet there can really be?
Thank you very much for having me. Limiting the internet connections and, let's say, the activities in the social networks and the cyberspace is one of the means of controlling the damages that protests can make to the public assets to the public, to civilians, and we experienced it actually a few weeks ago when some protesters and some let's say hooligans violently damaged many public assets. So the organizations, the arrangement within the groups was conducted via the internet and via the social networks, and this limitation put on that actually controlled that arrangement. So that was good for controlling the damage. Of course, it had its own difficulties for normal people like me, for example, who were using for our work or whatever we are using the internet for. So it was some difficulty for us. But anyway, the mindset is that when you are controlling the damage, you are actually helping the public, and that was the logic behind that about a month ago, and also we had experiencing it in a few days ago, especially on Wednesday and Thursday. We had some limits on the internet connections on the cell phones, not the landlines, but that was again because it was supposed to be some protests marking the 40th day of the killings that happened in the protests about 40 days.
Okay, so let's go to Khonche then. Khonche, I want to hear your thoughts about this because at some level, when the internet is limited, information also then trickles out, right? And that information is not always verified. So I imagine at some level that the Iranian authorities may be hitting themselves over the head with a hammer, where their argument is that, no, this is misinformation, such as what they've said about the Reuters investigation and that number 1,500 that Reuters is talking about the death toll in these protests. So if that is their argument, why then continue to limit the internet and the flow of information?
Well, the situation has become like a double or a doom loop. So we've got the maximum pressure campaign, and the idea is to deter that campaign. So any sign of weakness on behalf of the Iranians is a testament of the success of the maximum pressure campaign. So the idea is to withhold information, not to prevent the protesters from organizing themselves, but as a method of preventing the outside world from seeing any sort of success of the maximum pressure campaign.
Okay, so then let's talk about the maximum pressure campaign, Hamid, because that's something that I feel isn't spoken enough about, right? We're talking about the root causes here being economic. So when that fuel price hike happened, sure, it may have been done in a fashion, it probably could have been done, I should say it this way, in a better fashion by the government. But nevertheless, there hasn't been this contextualization of, listen, this is all happening because there is also this U.S. maximum pressure campaign, at least in international media, to the extent that I feel it should be. Why is that, do you think? Is it as simple as just saying it's mismanagement within the country?
Well, first of all, Iran doesn't have the best PR when it comes to delivering information or details about what's going on in the country. I think they feel that it's just futile anyway, because the balance of misinformation or propaganda against Iran is so heavy that there's really no point in trying to portray Iran in a better light. The fact is that this fuel price hike policy happened overnight almost. I mean, it was deliberated over a period of time, but it was just implemented overnight with little or no consultation with the people. So in that sense, it had an impact that nobody was expecting. On the other hand, yes, part of it has to do with the pressure of the sanctions, part of it has to do with just the country's general isolation, but Iran has certain structural issues when it comes to the economy that it has to work out by itself. So I don't want to just simply blame this on sanctions, because Iran is also progressing. It's developing economically, politically in its own way, on its own path. But definitely the sanctions have had some impact on Iran's just general well-being, as you know, surely.
Hamid Reza in Tehran, what are your thoughts on that same issue? Do you think that, when you speak to media as well, international, that there is enough understanding really about what the root cause here really is?
As Khadija said, it is not sanctions, though they have some impact on that. And it's mainly about the mismanagement of the government. especially in the way they conducted this plan. The point is that about the sanctions, everyone was actually arguing that just a couple of months ago, were saying that the maximum pressure campaign has failed and there was no success in that. But now, after the protests erupted in Tehran and in Iran, many try to actually hijack the protests to show that it is the consequence and result of the maximum pressure campaign. So yes, they are trying to show this because they want to say that, let's say they want to revive actually the maximum pressure campaign and its literature and all the arguments they have about that, to put pressure on Iran and to unite everyone against Iran. But the reality on the ground is that the maximum pressure has been dead for long because nothing is affecting more on the Iranian economy. There is no transactions actually, let's say, in official ways. So the economy has been suffering those problems for years, and it's not something new. And it doesn't have anything to do with actually the dissatisfaction that the maximum pressure is trying to make among the Iranian public against the, as they call it, regime. So.
Yeah.
The way that they
if I could just come in, Hamid Reza, because I think there's one thing I wanted to hone in on, if you allow me, and that is about the narrative when it comes to protests in general, right? Like what we're talking about right now, both you, Hamid Reza, and yourself, have mentioned the fact that, listen, this may be government mismanagement, right? But to the outside world, when protests happen in Iran, it's all about regime change, right? Is that unfair as well, do you think, where there isn't even the space given to legitimate grievances just within whatever respective system may be in place in Iran towards the government, again, as I said, about mismanagement, corruption, etc.?
I think it's just the utter disregard of the international community when it comes to human agency, when it comes to the needs and the demands of the Iranian people, which are bread and butter issues at this moment. It's not always about regime change, toppling the government, bringing about violent revolutionary change, which, as we've seen in the region, is just a failed policy, a failed model. We've seen conflagration in the region because of this kind of mentality. So the fact is that Iranians have particular needs. Now, because they're being lionized by the international community, they're being egged on, go into the streets, fight for your rights. What's happening is that we've got banks that are being burned, government buildings that are being burned, violence, as you can see from these images, that this is not a form of airing out grievances. This is not the proper channel to communicate whatever plight they're suffering. And everything that is being brought in from outside is simply negative. So it's understandable that there's going to be barriers and walls that Iran will build in order to prevent any more deleterious information, impact from coming into the country, which is an answer to your very first question, which is why has Iran shut down its internet or its mobile services and things like that.
So Hamid Reza in Tehran, let's talk then about how then the Iranian government reacts when you have the international community reacting in the way that it does about any protest that takes place, any large-scale protest becomes a protest about regime change to the international community. Do you think that sometimes the Iranian authorities might misuse that to label everything almost a riot? And then some of those grievances and those genuine complaints sometimes then become overlooked?
No one in Iran is denying the public right to show their protest or to show their anger or disagreement with decision and the situation. It has been actually recognized by many people, many officials, from the leader to the president and to the ministers, and everyone has been actually recognizing that right. There are two problems. First of all, Iranian government has a problem of public relations. It is not capable in let's say, announcing what is going on, in informing the world about the situation in Iran. And that's the first problem. The second problem is that we are always suffering from the outside involvement and intrusion, let's say. they are trying to actually take advantage of every movement inside Iran to translate it into a regime change demonstration or protest. And that's something that has happened for many years now. But you can understand that when it is genuine public protest, or it is something directed from outside, when by following the people, in recent protests about 40 days ago, the public people, the normal people who were angry on the streets, they very soon realized that there are some rioters among them, and they try to distance themselves from them. Yes, on the first couple of days, we had hundreds and thousands of people on the streets, but in 1 or 2 days after that, when they saw actually the riots, the violence, the damages, the hooliganism that was going on, then they moved back. Actually, the protesters forgot about their protest. They preferred to actually step back so that they would not be part of the vandalism that was going on. So that there is where you can actually realize. That is what happened actually 2 days ago on Thursday. There were a lot of, announcements for marking the 40th day of killings, as those who are trying to topple the followers, actually the supporters of regime change, were actually talking about on social media. But you saw on the streets there were not many people. We can say there were no people actually, because the people, as we call it, the public people, the public Iranians did not support that, and they did not come to the streets.
Okay, so Gonchi, I wanted to take a moment and talk then relations with the U.S., because at the root of this, as we've spoken about, possibly, sanctions do play some role, certainly, in the difficulties that the Iranian economy faces. There's been a lot of talk, and I watched a recent interview with Ali Akbar Velayati with international media, and he's, of course, special advisor to the leader of Iran, the supreme leader, that is. He said that no, there are no relations and there are no talks right now between the U.S. and Iran. But at the same time, we now have Foreign Minister Zarif, who's going to be going to New York in January, in fact, and there's a lot of rumors about, who he may be meeting behind the scenes there. Do you believe that there are talks happening behind the scenes, and what possibly, and of course we're all looking into the crystal ball here and just guessing, but what sort of talks might those be if they are taking place?
Generally, Foreign Minister Zarif has always expressed openness to dialogue, to negotiation, to even going back to the same table on which the JCPOA was drafted and then torn into pieces by Trump. He's still willing to engage with the original participants or the signatories. So I would not be surprised if there were back channels or any sort of reaching out. I would not be surprised if that were to happen. I can't officially make a statement on that because it's all, as you said, we're looking into a crystal ball. But generally, based on the attitude or the disposition that the Supreme Leader has expressed, I think they are open and it could happen. However, I think ultimately the feeling is that, again, based on all of the events and all of the components of the maximum pressure campaign, it's highly unlikely anything will come out of it. I mean, the foreign minister himself was sanctioned. So, there has to be reciprocity. Otherwise, where are we going to get? And what we've seen is that Iran has simply become more and more defiant over the past few months. This tit-for-tat, eye-for-an-eye approach of Iran just simply shows that in its own revolutionary ideology, it is fighting neo-imperialism. It is standing up in the face of global arrogance, which the Supreme Leader mentions frequently. And so really we've come to a dead end. Now, these little conversations behind the scenes, really, in the scheme of things, are probably very ineffectual or inconsequential, I would say, unfortunately.
Do you agree with that, Hamid Reza? There's been, of course, a lot of talk, hasn't there, about how Zarif has good relations sometimes with especially many of the lower-level U.S. officials, not necessarily those who are, specific foreign secretaries or otherwise, but he has had good relations even with people possibly in the Trump administration, again, those who work behind the scenes. Do you think that sort of relationship or that sort of friendliness will help break the ice at some level between these two countries?
Nothing serious can happen in such dialogues and negotiations, either on the table or behind the scenes, whatever it is. Nothing serious can happen unless the United States, all in its general policies, decides to be actually cooperative in negotiations. We have had negotiations, we had the Iran deal, and the United States did not actually follow that. Any other agreements can be witnessing the same actually consequences and the same destiny that the JCPOA had. So nothing serious can happen. What is being discussed here in Iran is that ahead of the parliamentary elections in less than 2 months now, it seems that the government is trying to show some hope for further dialogues or further negotiations and some openness in the economy in order to win some votes in favor of his own, let's say, party or the candidates who are more closer to government. But if we think that such negotiations can lead to anything serious, anything like the JCPOA we had, no, I don't think that would happen unless, because the Supreme Leader has said for several times, different people, including President Rouhani, have said that if the United States wants an agreement, they need to get back to the JCPOA, they need to remove all the sanctions, and after that we can discuss anything further.
Okay, Gunche, I'll give you the final word on the issue of JCPOA. In fact, I wanted to ask, do you think that Iran can be forced back to a negotiating table to renegotiate, in fact, the JCPOA? Because that's been a very public demand of Donald Trump.
When you say forced, do you mean simply through punitive action?
Yes.
In what sense?
Yes, that's what I mean.
Because
through these sanctions or otherwise, yes.
Okay, in terms of sanctions, Iran is still surviving. It's still keeping its head above the water. In terms of military attack, well, we had the window of opportunity in the summer. Nothing happened. In terms of regime change, we've seen all of these protests since 2009. Massive upheaval in 2009, and that wasn't coordinated. There was no social media. Social media wasn't so advanced as it was today. There were millions marching around. Nothing happened. So exactly how is Iran going to be forced to the table? And also, if you think about it, Iran's just kicked off its first naval exercises with Russia and China in the Indian Ocean. So, I mean, really, what do we have? What kind of pressure? What more pressure can be imposed on Iran to get it to act differently? There's really, the US has really run out of options at this stage, I would say.
That's a very good point to end on. Of course, sure, go ahead, Gunche. Go ahead, Gunche.
I'd also like to add that really, in order for things to change, it's not about bringing Iran to the negotiating table. It's about a paradigmatic shift in the way that the US approaches Iran, engages Iran. You know, it's the whole carrots and the sticks approach. As I've said before, it's just become sticks now. So it's not going to work. Iran has its own trajectory, and this has to be respected.
Exactly. As Iranian officials always say, mutual respect, right? So we'll leave it there at that, a final word. And of course, we appreciate Gunche and Hamid Reza for their time today and of course, their insight on this issue. A lot of the news that comes out of Iran, viewers, especially that comes out online, especially through social media sites, is not always verified, right? And then when you have internet blockages, sometimes the information trickling out is even less reliable because you don't know if the source even is on the ground really in Iran, if you're relying on people who are completely outside the country and possibly conflating, increasing, and or downplaying what's happening in the country as well. So it's always important to hear from people on the ground and those who have connections directly on the ground as well. Is it smart, though, for Iran to be blocking the internet? Does it need to do that to secure its own people? That's, of course, the argument from the Iranian government side. And it seems at some level it may be a valid one because Iran is not the only country, mind you, that does this with the argument that it needs to secure its people and its national security at times from those who are misusing online platforms. Then there's the issue of the root cause of all this. It is the sanctions maximum pressure campaign at some level, as well as, of course, mismanagement and corruption within government agencies and otherwise that play into the entire economic crisis that the country is currently facing. Nevertheless, the maximum pressure campaign is not working, as our guest there said. So Iran will not renegotiate the JCPOA as Donald Trump and as some even European signatories may want. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on that developing situation there in Iran, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.